Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. As much as I hate to do this, I'm going to spend this video wading through the political dirt of this 2012 election season. And I detest doing this. I detest delving into the dirt and the mudslinging. But sometimes one has to wade through the dirt in order to save from it a genuinely good man, such as Representative Ron Paul. I think Ron Paul is seriously threatening a lot of establishment figures, and the attacks on him have intensified recently precisely because he was doing well. He secured recently the endorsement of South Carolina State Senator Tom Davis and a few other notable colleagues of his, and as a result, there is a serious possibility that Ron Paul will do very well in the upcoming South Carolina primary. One of the constituencies that Ron Paul particularly attracts are voters who think outside of the traditional two-party political spectrum, particularly independents as well as Democrats who are open to voting for a non-Democratic candidate if that candidate more closely aligns with their actual views of what constitutes good policy. So in an effort to try to defray that effect, Fox News recently brought two analysts on the air who lied to a national audience about South Carolina being a closed primary. In fact, South Carolina is an open primary where any registered voter, be he a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, can come in and express a preference for the Republican nominee. Now, what this means is if Fox had represented that fact accurately, a lot of independents and Democrats might have come out and voted for Ron Paul. Now, however, many of them might be turned off by this erroneous and indeed falsified set of statements. I think Fox really needs to be held accountable for doing this. I think perhaps even legal action should be filed against Fox News and the two commentators on the air for so blatantly misrepresenting the facts. This is akin to a misrepresentation in commercial advertising. If you're being sold a product as food, but you're really being sold rat poison, and the company is advertising the rat poison as food, wouldn't you think that company would have a considerable degree of legal liability? Well, Fox has, of course, committed many transgressions against the truth and against objectivity. During the Myrtle Beach debate last night on January 16th, we saw that in full force. First of all, Fox handpicked the audience, and as a result, the people packing that debate hall were not representative of the South Carolina population. Greatly overrepresented in that audience were bigots and warmongers. When Ron Paul got one of the precious few opportunities that he had to speak, despite his promising performance in the polls in South Carolina, he was booed for advocating the golden rule in foreign policy. I kid you not. The moment he discussed the golden rule and treating other countries as we in the United States would want to be treated by them, there was a loud chorus of boos. This is the same audience that cheered on Mitt Romney when Romney promised that if he were president, he would also sign the NDAA. He would also not recognize any rights of due process or any liberties whatsoever for people suspected, and here's the key word, suspected, of terrorist activity. Now, that is completely barbaric. And Ron Paul is a very nice individual. He's very courteous. He's very civilized. If I were in his place on that podium and I encountered the kinds of boos that he encountered when mentioning the golden rule, I would directly challenge the audience. I would say, how dare you boo the golden rule? How dare you boo the principle of universal justice, of treating others with the same moral standards that one would wish to be treated? Are you a bunch of brutes? Are you a bunch of savages? Are you a bunch of moral monsters? That's what I would say. And I think with that kind of crowd, with that kind of bunch of belligerent jingoists, that's the only approach that might have a chance of working. Ron Paul, I think, made some very good points. He made some good points about the drug war and its terrible effect on minorities. He made some good points about economic freedoms. He made some good points about the Second Amendment and the importance of a citizenry that has the right to defend itself. However, he wasn't given much of a chance. Of all the candidates, of all the 5 candidates on that stage, Ron Paul was given by far the least time and attention. At the beginning of the debate, he was virtually ignored. And when he was asked questions, the questions were loaded, unlike the softballs that were thrown to Mitt Romney. It seems to me that the mainstream media have learned nothing, absolutely nothing at all, about being objective, about being factual in coverage, about being conveyors of information rather than gatekeepers of information, about actually representing public opinion rather than attempting to shape public opinion. And this is not just limited to Fox News by any stretch of the imagination. The Associated Press, even though that's supposed to be a purely factual reporting agency, continues to concoct pieces that try to assassinate Ron Paul's character in little bits. Because as you know, media content comes in little bits, so they try to chip away at the public perception of Ron Paul's integrity one bit at a time. Previously, it was with the completely factually unbased assertion that Ron Paul got 0 delegates in Iowa before the subsequent rounds of the Iowa caucuses have even happened. Now it's with regard to Ron Paul's tendency to take first-class flights when traveling as a congressman. There's a very simple reason why Ron Paul's campaign pays for first-class flights and why Ron Paul also takes first-class flights in his capacity as a U.S. representative. It's that the first-class flights are refundable, and plane schedules change very frequently, as I'm sure anyone who has traveled to any great extent by air will know. There are many frequent reschedulings and cancellations that are inconvenient for many travelers, but for someone on congressional business, those would be totally unacceptable. What happens if a congressman has a serious appointment to keep either in his home state or an important meeting, an important speaking engagement, and he can't make it because of a delayed flight? What does he get paid to represent his constituents for if he can't do his business as a U.S. congressman? Furthermore, a lot of the flights that Ron Paul actually took were paid for using his own money. His detractors allege, well, it's his salary as a congressman, but any government employee, any government official, after he receives that salary, that becomes his own private money to spend. And if they now begrudge Ron Paul for flying first class, what are they going to do next? Begrudge him for not buying the cheapest possible groceries because his salary as a congressman gets paid for by taxpayers? It's a completely ludicrous set of allegations. The New York Times has also admitted a deliberate decision to downplay Ron Paul's campaign. In a recent article, Arthur Brisbane, the public editor of the New York Times, has stated that at the very beginning of the campaign season, before any results actually were apparent, the New York Times made the deliberate decision to downplay the campaigns of both Ron Paul and Rick Santorum. And oh, lo and behold, they were surprised. Well, of course they were surprised. They had denied a priori that there was any coherent narrative to those campaigns, when Ron Paul's campaign and the set of ideas that Ron Paul represents have had a narrative, a coherent narrative behind them for centuries even before Ron Paul's time. So I don't know where the New York Times editors were during all of human history, why they have been sticking their heads in the metaphorical sand. But now, in this article, Arthur Brisbane wrote that, well, Rick Santorum is the new rising star. Since when? Yes, he had a good performance in Iowa, but in New Hampshire he came nowhere close to Ron Paul. And even in South Carolina, I have a good degree of confidence that Ron Paul is going to beat him. Ron Paul was only mentioned once in Brisbane's article, in the sentence where he said that the New York Times previously made the deliberate decision to downplay him. And while he implicitly apologized for that treatment of Rick Santorum, he said nothing further of Ron Paul. Again, the mainstream media vacillate between totally ignoring Ron Paul and vilifying him when they do cover him for a little bit. And then, of course, there's the matter of that absolutely heinous, hateful Facebook group, Stop Ron Paul in 2012. This group is led by an individual named Jerry Brower. J-E-R-E is the spelling of his first name. And what this group has been doing is, I think, worst of all. They have been calling ordinary voters and falsely representing themselves as members of the Ron Paul campaign. And they have been saying all sorts of despicable filth in an attempt to associate it with Ron Paul. Racist, pro-Ku Klux Klan, anti-Semitic filth. And a lot of voters, unfortunately, who have been contacted by these appalling efforts were convinced that Ron Paul actually believed what this group represented him as believing. Now, that kind of impersonation, that kind of fraud, because that is what it is outright fraud, deserves a decisive response. Take down this Stop Ron Paul Facebook group, because they're not playing by the rules, they're not obeying the law, they're not respecting people's rights to due process. As for the rest of us, as for me, what we can do is dispel those misrepresentations. And I think the Stop Ron Paul Facebook group has been capitalizing on this bogus scandal of the Ron Paul newsletters, which have been shown time and again not to have been authored by Ron Paul, to have been repeatedly disavowed by Ron Paul, and yet media opportunists like James Kirchick have been peddling this false story for many years now. And look at what that has produced. Now this even worse, far worse Facebook group is using that skewed public perception that has been created by the newsletters as a basis to launch its own character assassination of Ron Paul. Let's not let them. We can talk to people. If they bring up these kinds of terrible, fraudulent misrepresentations, we can tell them the truth. We can tell them what Ron Paul actually thinks. That Ron Paul actually holds Martin Luther King as one of his great heroes. That Ron Paul has repeatedly written that racism is a terrible, ugly, collectivistic fallacy. That Ron Paul is no bigot, he's no anti-Semite, He's not against gay people. He's not against individuals who choose to lead the lifestyle that they deem to be best. He believes in liberty for all of them. So the truth is the best antidote to this kind of terrible slander. Or, as one might put it in other terms, sunlight is the best disinfectant. There's still time. There's still time to correct these erroneous public perceptions. There's still time to spread good ideas. There's still time for Ron Paul to improve his performance even further and to win some primaries and to win the Republican nomination. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this trip through the political dirt has led you to come out the other way without being too marred by it, maybe even a little cleaner in terms of knowing what the truth is and being able to spread it to others.